and welcome to how hard is that? Welcome to a video. No, welcome to another video. I would have read it for, it's incredibly it was my favorite of Hello and welcome to another video. My name is Heather and as always I'm reading with a vengeance and I hope you are too. I hope you are as excited to watch this video as I am to make it because of course I'm talking about my favorite books of the year and you all know how much I love to talk about books that I love. It was the whole reason I started this channel. The way I choose my favorites of the year, it's all about how I still feel about them, how I feel about them now, how much of the characters I remember, how much of the story I remember. I don't pick my favorites of the year by looking at my Goodreads ratings and saying, oh, that was a 5-star, it must be my favorite of the year. That's just not how it goes here. There are a few stats and history of making this video that I want to talk about, just for a little bit of context. So last year when I did my favorites of 2022, I did a video where I talked about my 20 favorites because I read so many books to start off with, and then so many of those books were stellar. So it was really hard for me to choose 10, and not just hard, it was impossible. That's why I did a top 20. And not only that, I couldn't really rank them until I got to maybe my top 7, if I remember correctly. And then I couldn't really come up with a number 1. I had 3 books that tied for number 1 as my favorite of the year for 2022. Was it a cop-out? Perhaps. But whether it was the fact that I read slightly fewer books in 2023 than I did the previous year, or maybe I read fewer stellar reads than I did the previous year, I'm not quite certain, but I was able to narrow it down to a top 10 of the year, my top 10 favorites. I do have some honorable mentions. Maybe that's my cop-out this year. And I'll also talk about why they didn't make the list. I think that's fair. But just to compare 2023 to 2022, so I read 165 books in 2022. That's a lot of books. However, a lot of them were picture books. I really got into picture books in 2022. I really enjoyed it. I didn't stop on purpose. It just didn't work out that I continued to read as many picture books in 2023. So because I read 165 books in 2022, I set my reading challenge on Goodreads at 150 books, and I didn't quite make it. I read a total of 136 books, and that's not including the DNFs that I attempted. I had a total of 10 DNFs in 2022, and I had a total of 8 DNFs in 2023. But I feel really good about the number of books I was able to read. It's not a race, it's not a competition. I totally get that. I'm not trying to shame anybody. I'm not trying to brag. These are just stats that I'm putting out there for context of how many really good books that I read and really what types of books that I was reading too, because a pretty good number of the 144 attempts I made were short stories and essays and novellas. And so that is leading me to tell you that I am only including in the eligibles for my top 10 full-length novels. So as far as the books that are eligible for my top 10 favorites of the year, the number of full-length novels that I read in 2023 was 102, compared to 115 in 2022. And just a few more disclosures before we get to them. Only 2 books on this list were published in 2023. In fact, 2 of the books are over 20 years old. And also, I do have one last cop-out for my awards show, and that is these are not ranked. I just couldn't possibly have done both condensing a list of favorites to 10 and ranking them. They're just all so different. So these, I would consider them all tied for number 1. So I'm going to talk about them with you in the order that I read them last year. That's just the best that I can do. Just really quickly, I'm going to go through the honorable mentions of the year and maybe a quick word on why they didn't make the cut. A Prayer for the Crown Child by Becky Chambers. As you know, this is the second in the Monk and Robot series. A Song for the Wild-Built, I believe, was a favorite of 2022. A Prayer for the Crown Child was the very first book that I read of 2023. It was the very first 5-star. I absolutely loved it. It didn't make the cut because it was too short. Your House Will Pay by Steph Cha. I really can't think of any other reason that it didn't make the cut other than just the 10 that did make the cut I loved more. Memphis by Tara M. Stringfellow. I thought for sure this was going to make the list. Beautifully written, beautiful story. This book absolutely was one of my favorites this year. It didn't make the top 10. Absolutely love this book. Just love some other ones more. Ozark Dogs by Eli Craner. Oh my goodness, love this book. Incredible adventure story. Just another book I had to make an impossible choice. Young Mungo by Douglas Stewart. I was super surprised by how much I loved this book. I have to say it didn't make the top 10 for a couple of reasons. It was kind of really hard to get into. I think it could have stood with some editing. And unfortunately, because I listened to the audio, the really thick Scottish accent was at times hard to understand. I really wish that I had read the physical copy, but ultimately it stays in my heart. I'll never forget Mungo. Triptych by Karen Slaughter. Absolutely love this book. Had me on the edge of my seat the whole time. What an incredible mystery, thriller story. An incredible twist, fantastic opening to the Will Trent series. I think the only reason it didn't make my top 10 is it didn't have that thing. While this story was just so gripping, if it doesn't make me just want to hug it to my chest, then I mean, that's really the only reason it didn't make the top 10. How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix. Love this story, incredibly scary. Great story about haunting, about relationships between brother and sister, about grief. It had Grady Hendrix's signature dark humor in it. Absolutely love this book, so much fun. But again, it wasn't one of those books that made me want to hold it to my chest and give it a hug for 3 days. And finally, the last of the honorable mention is the last book that I finished in 2023. I read the very last page of the very last book on December 31st, and that is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. The only reason this book didn't make the top 10, I would say, is because it didn't really grip me from the beginning. It talked a lot about gaming, which I am not into. I ultimately ended up really loving this book, but because it started off a little on the meh side, it didn't make the cut. Okay, let's get started. Let's get to why we are all here. The first book that I read in the year 2023 that made it to my favorites list will come as no surprise to you because I went on and on about this book, multiple videos, and that is the beloved winner of the Women's Prize for Fiction, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. Of course it's going to make this list. I knew it was going to make this list when I finished it. The thing though about this book is that it took me by surprise. I, if you remember, dreaded reading this book. The only reason I even picked it up was because I was judging the Booktube prize and I was assigned this book. And if that didn't happen, I would have read it anyways because I like to read the long list for the Women's Prize for Fiction, which of course it was on. And why did I dread it? Well, I had a terrible history with Barbara Kingsolver. So when this beast of a book that came out that is a retelling of a classic, another genre that I don't get along with, I thought I was going to hate it. I thought I was going to DNF it. That is just the glory of reading, right? We pick up a book that we don't think is going to have any effect on us and it ends up being a love of our lives. Why did I love it? If you read it, you already know. But of course, Demon Copperhead is a contemporary retelling of the classic Charles Dickens novel, David Copperfield. And if it sounds like I stutter when I say that, it's because I have a very hard time saying David Copperfield when Demon Copperhead is just so ingrained in my soul now. Demon himself is an amazing character. He's clever, he's funny, he has an innocence about him, while at the same time just having a worldliness to him and a knowledge of how things are in life. You cannot not love Demon. And it's a story about poverty and found family and surviving and finding your place in the world and reaching for more out of life even though you're born in an actual shit show. This was one of the first books that I read on the long list for the Women's Prize for Fiction, and I don't know if any of you saw the video, but I had predicted before I read any of the other books that Demon Copperhead was going to win. And if it sounds like I'm tooting my own horn, well, toot toot. I think this is going to endure to be a classic, and of course it was going to be a favorite of the year. Next on this list is Pod by Laylene Paul. Another book that not only was longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction, it was also, much to the chagrin of many people, shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. People either loved this book or they hated it, and they were super vocal on Booktube about how much they hated this book. Normally something like that would break my heart, but I just felt like I was fighting the good fight. This is truly a unique way to tell the story that is told in this book. This is literary fiction that explore themes that you would normally find in literary fiction. However, the characters are all marine animals. Themes of loneliness, otherness, survival, male toxicity, sexual politics, as well as climate change and how it affects the oceans and all the creatures that live within it. These are all explored in this book, and I think it's beautifully done. If you've been put off by this book because so many people talked about the reason they disliked the book was the rape of the dolphins, just keep in mind that we're talking about dolphins and that these kinds of sexual politics actually happen in the wild. And I just wouldn't let that put you off. It had such an emotional effect on me, a lasting effect on me, that it just couldn't not be a favorite of mine this past year. It's incredibly sad, but there are points of humor in it as well. And they're just such relevant topics in this book. The fact that people just view this book as just some weird dolphin book is just so reductive. There's so much more to this book. I absolutely knew it was going to be a favorite of mine when I finished it. Did you think that you saw the end of the Women's Prize for Fiction? No. One more. We have Wandering Souls by Cecile Penn. This is one of the 2 books on this list that actually were published in 2023. This is also a debut novel, which is by itself stunning. This book follows On, and she is a Vietnamese woman. She's around 16 or 17 years old. And this takes place in 1975, right at the end of the Vietnam conflict. And On and the rest of her family are fleeing the country, hopefully to get to the United States. But tragedy strikes, and On is left to take care of her 2 younger brothers. This story is about survival. It's about living in a foreign country, being forced to grow up before you were meant to be an adult. It's about racism, but specifically about racism towards the Vietnamese people at this particular time. This is also about grief. I also want to say that this had the best representation of generational trauma that I have ever read. The writing is stunning. There is a touch of magical realism that adds just a unique magic to the story that elevates it beyond just another historical fiction novel. This next book was another book that took me by surprise with how much I loved it. But not only is this a young adult book, it is known to be a modern classic. The book I'm talking about is Speak by Laurie Halse Anderson. This book just struck me like lightning. This book follows Melinda, a freshman in high school. It almost reads like Melinda's journal. So she's talking to you as the reader if you're listening to the audiobook. And as you're listening to Melinda tell her story, you know that something bad has happened to her. It turns out that she was sexually assaulted at a party the summer before she's to go into high school as a freshman. But the brilliance of this book is the assault itself, how it resonates in a young girl's life, in her personality, how she relates to others, how others relate to her, how it affects her for the rest of her life. Because the bulk of this story is really just day to day in the life of a 14-year-old girl. And for me, that was a special connection because I remember being in high school and it was a terrible time for me for so many reasons that I won't get into here. But it was just so nostalgic. And then when you get into how a sexual assault affects you, being a survivor of a sexual assault, I connected with that as well. And the way it's handled in this book is just so spot on. This book is absolutely timeless, and it's kind of sad to say it's timeless because this topic will never not be relevant, unfortunately. But I'm so glad that this book is out there. This is such an important conversation. I think this is a book that everybody should read because if you're not a survivor of sexual assault, I can guarantee you know somebody who is. This book just had such a profound effect on me. It was beautifully written. It was beautifully handled. And I can't think of another YA novel that has stuck with me as long as this one has. Next on this list, in a word, Marcellus. Of course, Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt is going to be on this list. Another debut novel. I mean, let's just think about that for a minute. What an amazing thing to be able to create stories that resonate so deeply with so many. And it wasn't just Marcellus the octopus, although he was such a fantastic character. Another thing I loved about this book was the fact that the main character was a woman of mature age. And I really, really appreciate that. I love that about Tova, who is our main character in this book. She is a recent widow. She also has never gotten over the disappearance of her son from 30 years ago. She works part-time at the local aquarium where she develops a bond with Marcellus. But you're also following Cameron, who is looking for his long-lost father, and he thinks he has found a clue, and that brings Cameron to the same town that Tova lives in, and they end up meeting, and it follows their developing friendship, and you discover a connection between the two, although it's not the connection that you think. And the story goes from there, and it's just lovely. This book is about forgiveness, it's about connection, it's about grief, it's about regular family and found family, and it's just handled beautifully. It has stayed in my heart for months and months. It'll probably stay in my heart even longer than it stayed on the bestseller list. Next on this list is The Light Pirate by Lily Brooks Dalton. This is also one of the first Cli-Fi books that I've read, at least one that has stuck with me and has become a favorite. And if you're wondering what Cli-Fi is, don't worry, that's the first time ever those words have come out of my mouth. I guess it's what they're calling climate fiction now. It works, kinda. Anyways, yes, climate fiction, and that's part of why I love this story so much. But really at the heart of the story is Wanda. You follow Wanda from before she's even born all the way up until she's in her 70s. She is born in the not too distant future in Florida, where things have gotten really bad as far as the climate change problem is. Natural disasters are happening more frequently to the point where most people are leaving Florida because of the floods and the hurricanes. And it's Hurricane Wanda, in which Wanda is born and named for. You're following Wanda as she grows up, as she loses many of the people that she loves. She is taught how to survive and live a somewhat normal life by her neighbor Phyllis, who is what we would call a survivalist or a doom prepper, if you will, but it has served her. She's not one of the loonies or crazies. She's super smart. She is a scientist, and she uses those skills to help Wanda survive in this world that puts survival at the very focus of everyday life. This is just such a wonderful story, and it talks to you about climate change without being preachy about it, and you will absolutely love Wanda as a character. We have a touch of magical realism. This story is both terrifying and hopeful at the same time. I just loved it so much. I hope you read it if you haven't already. This next book was such a fun read for me. It's probably the most lighthearted book on this list. I absolutely loved it. The book I'm talking about is Iona Iverson's Rules for Commuting by Claire Pooley. What an absolute freaking delight this was. We have Iona, who is a 57-year-old woman, a stylish, smart, independent woman. She's a columnist for a hot magazine, and she is starting to feel a very familiar phenomenon to me, and that is feeling like she is irrelevant among the more youthful people of society. But instead of cowering down, she is fighting back. But a big part of this story is the connections that Iona makes with several other commuters on her train who would never even speak to each other because of the titular rules for commuting. But something happens that draws several of the commuters together, and they are forced to speak to each other, and they're forced to get to know each other, and they discover that they are not the people that they expected them to be. And ultimately, this is a story about you can never judge anybody just by appearances or just by one single act or behavior. People just have way more depth than we give them credit for. This book explores that, and it's just heartwarming and inspiring, and I absolutely love Iona, and I connected actually with every single character. I laughed out loud several times, but at the same time, I just kind of learned something about human nature, or more, I was reminded some things about human nature that I think we all tend to forget sometimes. This was a cute, adorable story with some depth to it, and that's why it ended up on my favorites of the year. Next up is the only other book on this list that was published in 2023. The book I'm talking about is The Reformatory by Tananarive. Wow, just wow. This book is inspired by actual events surrounding the Dozier School for Boys that was a reformatory school in Florida up until 2011. And the author discovered that I think one of her uncles was a victim at this school, and that inspired her to write this story. But she put a very unique spin on this story. The Reformatory follows Robert Stevens Jr. He's an 11-year-old boy. His mother has died. His father has fled the town for political reasons, and so he lives with his older sister, Gloria. One day, Robert gets into trouble with one of the wealthy white boys of the town, and he gets sent to the Reformatory. It is discovered that he can see haints, and that is the southern word for ghosts. And when it's found out by the warden that he can see haints, the warden enlists him to hunt the haints and do away with them, because the warden believes that the ghosts of the school will expose the warden for the evil man that he is. So you're following Robert as he survives his time at the school, and you learn about all the horrible things that happened to the boys of the school. At the same time, you're following Gloria, who on the outside is doing everything she can to get Robert out of the school. And both of those storylines are incredibly compelling. There is a huge, delicious twist about halfway through the book. The writing here is just top-notch. I don't know why I haven't heard of this author before, but I will be reading more of her stuff. I'm really hoping to see this book on the long list for the Women's Prize for Fiction this year. Bottom line is this story needed to be told. And just be warned, while it is very literary, there's also a horror aspect to this story. There are some scary scenes. There's some very, very tense scenes, but I just don't want that to deter you from this book. It is excellent. I know this next book isn't going to be a surprise to you because I raved and raved and raved about it, and that's Swan Song by Robert McGammon. And just as a side note, one other book by him, Boy's Life, is one of my all-time favorite books, and this is added to that list as an all-time favorite. Swan Song is almost 1,000 pages long, and if you know me, you know that sometimes that detracts from my rating. If it gets over 500 pages, I sometimes get a little cranky. But this one could have gone on an additional 500 pages, and I would have been here for it. If I wasn't reading this book, I was thinking about reading this book. All I wanted to know was what was happening next. This is a post-apocalyptic story. It has, for many years, been compared to Stephen King's The Stand. It kind of has the same premise. In Swan Song, the apocalypse happens post-World War III. We nuke Russia, and Russia nukes us, and basically the world as we know it is decimated with a handful of survivors. You're following basically 3 sets of survivors at 3 kind of different geographical areas in the United States, and for one reason or another, they are being drawn towards each other until they ultimately meet up, connect, and it's an ultimate story of good versus evil. I feel like I'm oversimplifying the story. There's so much more in this book. Of course there is. The writing is incredible. The action is amazing. The characters are just so incredibly colorful and off the page. There is a level of tension that carried me throughout this whole book. Like I said, there are 3 sets of main characters, but there are a ton of side characters that you meet along the way. and so many people die. And I felt just so on the edge of my seat as I'm reading this, because I'm like, what if so-and-so dies? And what if so-and-so dies? And oh my God, if so-and-so dies, I'm going to be devastated. It was such a gripping story. I absolutely loved it. And it kind of really just takes your imagination and throttles it. As terrifying as it was so much fun. Thank you all so much for encouraging me the way that you did. I credit you just as much as I credit Robert McCammon for this book ending up on this list. All right, here we are, the last book on my list, but it is definitely not the least of my favorites. The final book that has ended up on my top 10 favorites is The Boy and His Dog at the End of the World by C.A. Fletcher. Oh my God, this book was so amazing. I'm so glad I read it. Here we are, another dystopian kind of post-apocalyptic story. This one takes place about 200 years into the future. The population of the planet has gone from 8 million down to 8,000, and different communities exist all along the world. And so there's this feeling of isolation. You're following Grizz, who is this 14, I think-ish year-old boy. He's living with his family, brother, sister, parents, on a coastal homestead. And one day they're visited by this strange man who comes in on a boat, and he appears friendly. And things happen, and ultimately this stranger steals Grizz's dog. And there is an importance to this dog that you kind of have to read about in the story. Grizz wakes up the next morning and discovers that this man has stolen his dog, and he decides to set out on his own with his other dog and follow this stranger and get his dog back. The rest of the story is following Grizz on this adventure journey. He meets people along the way. He gets into situations that are life-threatening. This is a coming-of-age story. This is about family and loyalty and what we do for the things and people we love. Another story of survival, of course. I think that is kind of an ongoing theme in my favorites of the year. There are not one, but two delicious twists, and those elevated the story. There is humor in this book. There is suspense. I knew the second I finished the last page of this book that it was going to be a favorite of the year. If the way I raved about it in my wrap-up wasn't enough, hopefully it's enough if you haven't read it that you pick this book up. I promise you, you'll love it. I want more books like this in my future. So that's it. Those were my favorites of 2023. Have you read any of these books? And if not, why not? Were you able to predict some of these books? I want to know what your favorites were, so please tell me down below, or just say hello or Happy New Year down in the doodly-doo. Here's to another year of books and favorites and stories that weave their way into our hearts. Thank you all so much for your support and for watching and tuning in and just making this whole Booktube thing even that much more enjoyable for me. And I will see you all next time. Bye-bye!